Welcome everyone. Today we are going to learn a very important topic which is synapse. What is synapse? In previous classes we learned that a neuron has three parts. A neuron has cyton, axon and dendrites. These dendrites they receive the stimulus or nerve impulse, then they convey it to the cyton. Cyton then passes this nerve impulse to the axon. On the end of the axon, this axon is branched. These branches are called as terminal arborization. We know that, and each branch has a knob-like structure at its end, which is called as synaptic knob. But this neuron or any of the neuron, they are not in contact with each other. Means one neuron is not in direct contact with another neuron. There is a gap between these two neurons. This junction is called as synapse. The junction between the terminal arborization of one neuron and dendrites of another neuron. This junction is called as synapse, or we can say the close proximity between two neurons is called as synapse. We know these are not in direct contact with each other and they lie very close to each other. This is called as synapse. Now question is, when these neurons are not in direct contact, then how nerve impulse is passed from one neuron to another neuron? In this synapse, there is a gap between these two neurons, which is called as, this gap is called as synaptic cleft. The gap between two neurons is called as synaptic cleft. Although this gap is very small, it is about 200 angstrom. But how this nerve impulse passes through this gap? Let's find it out. When nerve impulse reaches to the axon, I have shown it a little larger here. It will make us easy to understand this. Now, when nerve impulse will reach into the axon, it will pass on to all these synaptic knobs. Now, we will say that this nerve impulse has reached in the synaptic knob. Now this is the synaptic knob. This synaptic knob, it is the synaptic knob of first neuron, which is called as presynaptic neuron. This is the synaptic knob of presynaptic neuron. Now when electric impulse or nerve impulse reaches into this synaptic knob contains the vesicles which are called as synaptic vesicles. These synaptic vesicles contain chemicals which are called as neurotransmitters. These chemicals are called as neurotransmitters. Now, when nerve impulse reaches there, there is a change in the synaptic knob. What changes occur? Calcium is taken in. Calcium ions are taken into this synaptic knob from synaptic cleft or from the surrounding. When calcium ions enter into this synaptic knob, it makes these synaptic vesicles to release the chemicals by the process of exocytosis. When these synaptic knobs release the chemicals here in this synaptic cleft, now these are the neurotransmitters. This is neurotransmitter. For example, a common example is acetylcholine. There are other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, there is dopamine, there is serotonin, glycine, etc. And acetylcholine is the most commonly found. Now, when this synaptic vesicle, it releases the chemicals, these neurotransmitters, by the process of exocytosis, they will enter into the synaptic cleft, this gap here. Now, they will reach to the dendrites. Here, they reach here into the dendrite. This is the dendrite. We can say it is the postsynaptic neuron. This is presynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic neuron. It is the dendrite of another neuron, which lies closely to it. Now, when these neurotransmitters which pass this gap, they are received by the dendrites. These dendrites have receptors, and these receptors receive these are the receptors. These receptors receive the neurotransmitter, and they start a new nerve impulse in this. Like here, when these will release here, these neurotransmitters will be released. They will be taken up by the receptors of these dendrites of this another neuron, and these dendrites will start a new nerve impulse, which will be passed to the cyton and it will be passed to the axon. In this way, nerve impulse is conducted from one neuron to another neuron. This is called as presynaptic membrane. This is called as postsynaptic membrane. And these, when these neurotransmitters are received by these receptors on the dendrites, they depolarize it. They cause a change in the dendrite. What changes occur? Here, sodium is taken in, and potassium is potassium leaves this dendrite, and sodium enters into this, which depolarizes it, this membrane, and this start a new nerve impulse in the second neuron. In this way, it's conducted from one neuron to another neuron. Here we can say it was here electric impulse, but this impulse is here changed into chemical impulse, because this electric impulse is changed into chemical impulse, and this chemical impulse then initiates, this starts again this nerve impulse, this electrical impulse. But here it is passed by chemicals, which are called as neurotransmitters. As I told, acetylcholine is the commonly found neurotransmitter in our body. Now, this junction is called as synapse, and these junctions are also called as neuron junction. And there are other junctions like neuromuscular junction, neuroglandular junction. That is, when these dendrites receive the nerve impulse, they will pass on to the another neuron, and it will reach to the brain. Brain interprets that nerve impulse, that signal, and it sends the nerve impulse through motor neuron. When motor neuron will reach to the target organ, because this nerve tissue will not make any action by itself, it will make other to do some action. For example, if we touch any object, here skin acts as a receptor, it's the sense organ. It will take this nerve impulse, it will provide this, we can say, transmit this information to the sensory neuron. This sensory neuron will take it to the brain, and brain will interpret it, and then it will send back information to the through motor neuron. But its target will be muscle. It will make this muscle to contract, due to which this hand will be withdrawn back, and in this way it causes the action. And same occurs in all these, same process occurs in all these junctions. We will discuss here the neuromuscular junction. That is, when the brain interprets the nerve impulse and it reads that signal, then it sends another nerve impulse through motor neuron. That motor neuron will affect the muscle or any gland. Now what happens at that junction? When message will be there in, it will be passed on through axon endings, that terminal arborization. You should keep into mind that this nerve impulse always passes or flows from dendrites to axon. From axon to dendrites. It will never pass from this dendrite to axon. From dendrites, nerve impulse cannot go towards the axon. It comes from axon and then go towards the dendrites, because these dendrites will they doesn't contain the synaptic knobs. They doesn't have the neurotransmitter. Then how can it will be passed on from dendrite to here into the synaptic knob? The information always passes, this nerve impulse always passes from synaptic knobs to the dendrites. This is one-way traffic. Now, when there is this motor neuron, this brings the you can say nerve impulse from the brain. Then how does this nerve tissue cause action? When this motor neuron, when it will bring the nerve impulse, and here is the muscle tissue, for example, here is muscle tissue. The same process occurs in all junctions, as I told earlier, in neuromuscular junction, in neuroglandular junction, or from when a receptor receives the stimulus and it passes it to the dendrites of the sensory neuron. Same process occurs in all. Now what happens when this motor neuron brings the nerve impulse from the brain? Now when it reaches to the brain, when it reaches to the motor neuron, reaches to the muscle, here is also a gap. Then what happens here? When it reaches to the muscle tissue, it releases the neurotransmitters. It releases the chemicals. When these chemicals reach to the muscle tissue or any muscle, when you can say this is muscle, when these neurotransmitters will reach to the plasma membrane of the muscle, which is called as sarcolemma, it depolarizes it. The way it depolarizes it here, it will depolarize it, it will stimulate it. What will happen? This depolarization will be passed on to the endoplasmic reticulum of the muscle cell. Endoplasmic reticulum, here it is called as sarcoplasmic reticulum. When this depolarization will be passed on from sarcolemma to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Here we can say this is sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now when it reaches there, it makes this sarcoplasmic reticulum to release the calcium ions. When it sarcoplasmic reticulum, when it releases calcium ions, these calcium ions activate an enzyme that lies in the muscle cells, which is called as myosin ATPase. This enzyme, myosin ATPase, it hydrolyzes the ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It hydrolyzes it. We know this is the ATP is adenosine triphosphate is the energy currency of the cell. It releases the energy. That energy, which is released by this enzyme, by hydrolyzing the ATP, that makes the myosin filaments to move inwards over the actin filament. Means they slide, these actin filament and this myosin filament, they slide one upon another. When they slide, this changes the shape and arrangement of the muscle, and in this way any action is caused, whether we can say we withdraw our hand or any contraction of the muscle. In this way this muscle, this nervous tissue cause action. This is also called as neuromuscular junction. I will repeat it. What happens when nerve impulse reaches the motor neuron and this motor neuron, when it reaches this inner impulse reaches into the synaptic knob, this synaptic knob releases the neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. That acetylcholine passes that gap and it reaches to the sarcolemma of the muscle cell. That gets depolarized. When that it is plasma membrane or sarcolemma, when it gets polarized, it passes this depolarization to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. For endoplasmic reticulum, it's called sarcoplasmic reticulum. That it makes that sarcoplasmic reticulum to release the calcium ions. Those calcium ions then activate the enzyme myosin ATPase, and this myosin ATPase hydrolyzes the ATP to release the energy. When energy is released, that energy makes myosin filament to move inward over the actin filaments. These actin and myosin filaments, when move or slide one upon another, then there is change in the shape and in the arrangement of the muscle cells, which brings the change in the whole muscle. In this way, nervous tissue cause action. Okay, and